Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is all about how we identify as athletes and how that identity can impact disordered eating and eating disorders. Now, before we start in with the main part of this podcast, I do want to make something abundantly clear. I'm not a specialist in this area, nor will I ever pretend to be. And it's with that sensitivity that whenever I want to discuss a topic such as eating disorders, I want to bring in the real experts into the room with me. You longtime listeners of the podcast will remember two separate podcasts I did with the fabulous Dr. Kate Bennett on this subject, and this podcast is an excellent extension of those conversations. So on the podcast today, we have Maddie Palermo. Maddie is a fifth-year doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the University of South Florida, where she is studying disordered eating behaviors and their connection to identity among athletes. I got to know Maddie's research and the work that the University of South Florida is doing as I was drafting some of the content of my book and in background research I had done with the podcast with Dr. Kate Bennett. I find Maddie's work absolutely fascinating and relevant to this ultramarathon audience. I don't need to tell y'all that ultra runners are a high identity group. We identify with our sport so much so that almost all of our friends, our entire peer group, and even the social bonds tend to highly revolve around our activities and training as ultramarathon runners. So it's with this social and behavioral context as a backdrop that I wanted to explore the connection between athletic and exercise identity a bit further, and Maddie's research neatly folds into this narrative. With that as a backdrop, open your ears and open your minds, and I'm going to get right out of the way. Get ready for this conversation with Maddie Palermo, all about identity and eating disorders. So, what's kind of interesting related to that is I've been familiar with your work for a few years. And then when I actually wanted to bring you on the show, it was surprising to me that you hadn't finished your doctorate yet. And I don't know whether that's just a representation of like your work and when it's been published or what. How can you explain that to me? Because when we had the correspondence, yes. I was like, oh my gosh, not that it's bad or anything like that, but it really surprised me because I've run across your work a couple of times before.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to hear that my work is kind of reaching the right people. So I am doing a clinical psychology PhD, which is typically 4 or 5 years of grad school in the traditional sense of classes, and you do research during that time, and you also do some clinical training. So I see clients and provide therapy as part of that. And I'm in my 5th year now, so I'm rounding out that cycle. And then in order to earn your degree, you have to do a 1-year clinical internship. So very similar to how med students match for residency, we all match for our 1-year internship. And that's like a 40-hour a week where you're providing therapy services as part of your internship. So that's where I'm going next. July 1st is my start date, and I'm doing my internship at University of California, San Diego.
Oh, so, other side of the
country.
Wow. Oh.
Yeah. So, and most people move for internship. That's just part of kind of the process. So once I complete that year, I finally earn the PhD. But, I think a really important part of earning the PhD is you're actively doing your research the entire 5 years, and you really come out ready to be an independent researcher and start your career.
Yeah, it's very thorough. I mean, once again, I've been
yes.
kind of familiar with the work that you've done and the work that your lab has done for a while, but for the almost all the listenership is not going to be familiar with that. So explain to the listeners what the Depth Lab at the University of South Florida actually does and who's involved and what kind of research are you guys working on?
Absolutely. So the Depth Lab stands for Disordered Eating Prevention, Treatment, and Health. And it's run by Dr. Diana Rancourt, who also studies eating disorders, disordered eating, and maladaptive exercise. So I am one of her 5 grad students, and we all kind of work within our different niches within the lab. So I really focus on identity and disordered eating and exercise behaviors. One of my fellow lab mates, he's really invested in sort of males and disordered eating and even exercise behaviors within that realm. Another one of my lab mates really does look at things like weight stigma and how that affects disordered eating behaviors. So we kind of all do our own little things under the same umbrella of trying to work towards understanding, preventing, and treating disordered eating and exercise behaviors.
And the exercise behaviors piece, it's not like unique or novel, but it's something that you're kind of like deliberately incorporating into this mix of how you guys are studying this complex mental health issue, right?
Yeah.
So why is that a specific focus of what you guys are doing?
So that's really important to me, actually. So for a really long time, exercise was just kind of thought of as, a component of an eating disorder. So someone might exercise to burn off food or exercise in order to eat. And that was really thought of as almost like a sort of behavior that goes along with having an eating disorder. And my whole thought process behind it is I think that someone can have disordered exercise and this maladaptive relationship with exercise without some of the other eating disordered behaviors. So maybe you're not binging, purging, or restricting, but it's really only this sort of exercise component that you're doing. And we often don't really look at that as its own independent maladaptive health behavior. So kind of taking a focus away from having that traditional eating disorder outlook and focusing more on, okay, are you having this maladaptive relationship with exercise that maybe you don't fit the classic eating disorder mold, and looking at it that way?
Well, and here's the thing. Here's why this research is kind of like so fascinating and also kind of almost befuddling, to be honest with you, in the endurance world, and in particularly in the world that I am, which is the ultra endurance world, is that the exercise behaviors are extreme by default, right?
Yes.
And it's very hard to unentangle extreme exercise behaviors with just normal, kind of like normal day-to-day training, because the clinical definitions of what many of you and your colleagues kind of like see either in practice or in research, those might be abnormal or atypical behaviors in your average population. Your average populations of students, which is a lot of what you all study, but they're more indicative, or they're more normalized in the cohort of ultramarathon athletes. As is the parallel to that is their eating behaviors, right? And so it becomes this really kind of like messy ball of wax to try to unentangle, especially for me as a coach when I'm working with athletes, to try to pick up on some of the cues and the identifiers for when I need to bring in like external assistance from people like you, or people like my colleague Kate Bennett, who I've had on the podcast before. So I'm hoping this podcast can kind of enlighten us to try to unentangle some of the stuff that I know that a lot of people are kind of confused by. So one of the things that you just mentioned is one of the areas of focus that you have is on athletic and exercise identity, and kind of create a little bit of a separation between those two and how that actually affects disordered eating or eating disorders. Before we get into it too much, because the topic is going to be really novel for a lot of the listeners, what are those two things very specifically, and how can we view them from more of a practical standpoint?
Absolutely. And so I think when you're thinking of an eating disorder, that's something that meets clinical diagnostic criteria. You're hitting all the boxes of someone who has, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa. It's really a clinical diagnosis that someone is given. And disordered eating behaviors, I think, is almost like a step back from that. So it's not so much that you're hitting clinical criteria for these things, but they might still be a little bit abnormal, or they could still interfere with day-to-day functioning. Maybe you're not doing it enough to where it reaches that clinical threshold, things of that nature. So it's a little nuanced behind it, but it's more of thinking of clinical diagnostic, or maybe just a little bit less severe than that. And one thing I also want to clarify too is when I talk about compulsive exercise, because can be very nuanced as well. I really try to stay away from thinking about exercise frequency as something that tells me if it's adaptive or maladaptive. Because I think someone who trains for marathons or ultra marathons, you're probably running a lot. And if you come into the clinical room and you're like, yeah, I run 18 miles a day or whatever, and if someone's only going on frequency, that might raise a flag. But what I really more like to think of it is your thoughts and feelings behind your exercise behavior. So is there flexibility there? Can you take a rest day when you're feeling unwell? Or when you're injured, how do you feel about taking a rest day? Or your thoughts and feelings about food consumption and exercise. So I think I try to really take a nuanced approach to that instead of just looking at it from a clear, oh, you're exercising a lot, this must be bad.
Yeah, it can't be volume dependent, right? Because when you're getting into like 20 or 30 hours a week of training, like a lot of ultramarathon athletes do and a lot of Ironman athletes do, and then I'm thinking about it, it kind of throws those norms. It throws a lot of those norms out of the window. So I want to get back to this identity piece, right? This identity between an athlete versus your kind of like exercise identity. And the point of view that I'm coming from is a lot of people find ultra running as a byproduct of an extension of a sport that they used to do, either running or team sports in college and things like that. And they end up finding like their tribe, right? Their community. And that's a big part of the trail running culture, so to speak. It is a very kind of like tight knit community. And I always like to say it's the same group of idiots. We just go to different locations. And it really is. I mean, you're in the sport for a few years and you kind of know everybody at that point. But in some cases, I've always viewed that as a potential negative, right? We're over identifying with the sport that we are participating in. And so I want this is your area of expertise. How would you view that? I mean, how first off, how are we separating an exercise identity versus an athletic identity? And when does that actually become potentially problematic?
Yes. And, I think this was something in my research career that really I was trying to tease apart as well. So at first, I was really interested in working with athletes and this idea of athletic identity and how it is measured in the classic literature, which, the scale we use to measure athletic identity has items on it that's like, I see myself as an athlete. I have many goals related to my sport, things of that nature. So it's very sport focused. I spend more time thinking about my sport than anything else. And it's really how much, and it can go from like, let's say 0 to 10. 10 being athletic identity is the most important thing in your life. And what I found is sometimes that classification fits athletes, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily always fit everyone because it's really focused on sport. And it depends how people think about their sport involvement. Some people who I've spoken to who do more of a CrossFit, they're like, well, I don't know if it's my sport necessarily, but it's really my passion and it's something I love. And that kind of brought me to the idea of exercise identity, which asks more things like being an exerciser is more than just exercising to me. I would feel a real loss if I couldn't exercise anymore. And I think a person can have both. I think a person can have both athletic and exercise identity. And I think it's really individual to what resonates more with the person. However, having too much of either one is where it gets to more of a problem. So if this is like the only thing in your life, exercise or athletic identity, and there's not much flexibility around it, then we start to see some problematic behaviors emerge occasionally from this.
And the paper that we're referring to, or most of the content that you were just referring to, kind of relates back to a paper that you wrote. This is a 2001 paper in Eating Weight Disorders. Is that the name of the paper? So I just got the abbreviation.
Yeah, Eating and Weight Disorders is the journal. And then it's called Understanding Athletic and Exercise Identity in Relation to Disordered Eating Behaviors.
And can you try to expand upon when it becomes too problematic. And because I know the listeners are trying to like, well, identify as an athlete, but and I identify and I like to, I like to run and these are my people as I spoke about earlier. But is there a threshold or even behavioral cues that you can focus in on that you as a clinician, when somebody kind of like comes into you and is consulting with you, that you would say, yeah, we need to reframe the way that you view yourself as an athlete or as somebody who exercises or as somebody who participates in this sport?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think what it really comes down to is how this identity is showing up in your life. So, for instance, if you have this really high athletic identity, but it's not causing you interpersonal difficulties, you're not having a difficult relationship with exercise, you're not engaging in disordered eating behaviors, maybe this athletic identity at its height, it is okay for you. I think where it comes into play is sometimes when this identity becomes very strong, then individuals engage in maladaptive behaviors to reinforce this identity. So when you're thinking about an athlete, and I've seen this, just anecdotally in my own clinical work, thinking about athletes, and that identity is so strong and they want to succeed so well that they're willing to then, they think it makes sense to reduce food intake to increase performance or lose weight to increase performance because I want to strive and succeed as an athlete. And that's actually going to be more harmful in the long run to your athletic performance and to yourself mentally. And so I think that that's where the question really leads to, is this something that can be maladaptive? But what's really interesting about this paper that we're speaking about is athletic identity was not really associated with many disordered eating behaviors or maladaptive exercise. It was that exercise identity that was more strongly associated with these things, which is interesting in and of itself, because I think a lot of people often think of athletes as this really at-risk population. And maybe for a lot of individuals, that's not the case.
So it's not the worst thing in the world to highly identify with the sport that you're doing or highly identify as an athlete within that particular sport.
From an eating disorder standpoint, it doesn't appear to be as problematic as maybe previously hypothesized.
Once again, that's why I found that interesting, right? Because we've heard that for years, that this very strong identity towards whatever sport that you were doing, whether it was running or gymnastics or, archery or wrestling or kind of whatever, like if you were really into it for whatever reason, that those behavioral qualities that really drew you into the sport, where you had high identification within that one sport group, also led to these disordered eating behaviors. And it kind of turns out to be that link isn't quite as strong as we initially thought.
Yeah, I know. It was surprising to me as well. And that really kind of changed my focus to, okay, maybe it's not athletes. Maybe it's not this athletic component. Maybe there's something with exercise. And when I wrote this paper, we totally were thinking, oh yeah, athletic identity, definitely going to give us some disordered eating, and was not the case.
Huh. Okay. So there's going to be some people that are listening to this podcast that are going to go to this paper that I mentioned, and I'm going to link it up in the show notes. Yeah. And one of the common themes that kind of resonates throughout a lot of you and your colleagues' works is you guys are doing it on college people, which is not indifferent from the sports science literature. That's the world that I'm in, right? We're in exercise science, sports science, and it's all college dudes. Like, let's just face it. Like most of the sports science literature out there, they're a good population to bring into the lab and to poke and prod, and you can do it for relatively free. And there's a lot of them out there. And the literature that you're producing has a similar tone, where it's a lot of college age athletes. And so people out there will want to know, well, is this translatable post-college when they're in normal life, when they're outside of the dorm, they're outside of the campus, they're grown, they've got kids and a job and a 401k and all this stuff. Like what things may or may not be translatable from what you guys are studying in that specific population group?
Yeah. So, I think that that's one thing with psych as a literature. We love our college students. And I think although we haven't had any data to support this yet, there probably are some levels of transition. I think if you're thinking about someone who's no longer a college student and is more of, adult functioning day to day, it may be that athletic identity doesn't have as much space or time, or it could be that athletic identity becomes one thing that someone really focuses on because there's not other distractions of college, classes, etc. So I do think in some ways this could transition out and thinking of, okay, well, what does this look like if someone's really experiencing high athletic identity or high exercise identity? Again, is this identity driving these maladaptive behaviors? And if so, maybe that's something to look inwards and question and wonder about your own experience with those identities. I do think that identity does go past the college student level, and is probably in some ways can be more important to someone post-college.
Yeah. I mean, I find both ends of the spectrum, right? Where I work with athletes that are immediately post-college and they're still a runner, and, becoming a trail runner and ultra runner is kind of an extension of that identity that they formed in college. And then also find, adult athletes later on in life that had no previous sport background that have now found some identity that they really connect with through that particular sport. And so your idea of this transitioning layers, I think kind of really holds true because people are coming at it from different parts of the continuum.
Yeah. And I do think that links up to another paper I wrote in a way. It's still among college students, but it was looking at athletic identity, self-reported athletic identity. So how much someone identifies and their self-reported level of competition.
Yeah.
And what we found was in individuals with high athletic identity, but were engaging in low levels of competition, that they were engaging in more disordered eating behaviors.
Wait a minute. Say that again, because I want that to kind of resonate, because everybody thinking, wait a minute, high this, low this leads to that. Say that again, because I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yes. So someone who has high athletic identity, so your athletic identity is really salient and important, but participating at low level of competition. So let's say rank your competition level on a scale of 1 to 10. Someone on that lower side of engaging in competition level, that individual is engaging in more disordered eating behaviors.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And you kind of you can speculate a little bit on why that actually is from a clinician's point of view. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about that identity not being fulfilled.
Yeah.
So if it's so important to you, athletics and engaging in athletic activities, and then you're kind of let's say you came from, so again, this was among college students. So let's say you came from being a high school varsity athlete, and now you're playing intramural level. That's a huge shift. Maybe you weren't going to play in college, but that's still a huge shift in expectations and, sport level that you're really engaging in. And that could be really unfulfilling. So you're so used to something else.
Well, it's important because it's not the other way around too, right? People with low athletic identity that are competing at a high level, think that they have a high level of competition, don't have those same behaviors.
Nope.
And it's all about the fulfillment gap, or what I'm calling the fulfillment gap.
That feels accurate to me. Yeah.
Wow. So so freaking interesting. So, one of the things that I wanted to get your opinion on is Ultramarathon has this kind of rich history of trying to manipulate eating behaviors in an ergogenic way, right? So we have all of these different types of nutrition tools at our disposal. We can manipulate macronutrient intake. We can manipulate the total energy intake. And it's all done mainly at the elite level, but it also kind of trickles down into the recreational level to try to improve performance. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get your take on this as a clinician, because I'm kind of fascinated by it, because some people will take the position or take the argument that doing that is a slippery slope, right? You're kind of you have a kind of a primed population, right?
Yeah.
For eating disorders and disordered eating, and now you're throwing in an intentional, carrot to them, no pun intended, to kind of fuel that behavior. And so, knowing what you know about the behavioral side as well as the predisposition side, which is what we were talking about earlier, how these behaviors kind of predisposition people. What do you have to say about incorporating some of these strategies intentionally as like a ergogenic aid of sorts?
I think it would, to me, I'd really want to be mindful of how the client or the individual was talking about flexibility of these behaviors. So, for example, you got a race coming up in a month, and maybe you're going to do some different eating patterns or try different things to improve performance for that month. And then you're going to go back to eating normally. Or even within that month, you've got a couple of days where you're having different meals that might not follow that exact diet. And it's not the end of the world. It's not something that is so distressing. And I think that's where I really come at it from a clinical perspective. Is there distress created by this diet? Is there rigidity created by this diet? And how long does that last? Because I think if something is a temporary option to improve performance, and there's flexibility and ability to kind of go back, then it might not raise as much of a red flag when I'm thinking of a clinical perspective as someone who's adopting this and is going to these extreme lengths for a long period of time.
It's interesting. So I'm going to link this up in the show notes to my previous discussion with Kate, that I mentioned earlier. That's basically the exact same thing that she always tunes into. She says she'll always tell me whenever I'm helping, whenever she's kind of like helping me navigate these things, or whenever I'm kind of like asking her counsel on stuff, that the lack of flexibility or rigidity in the whatever strategy that you're actually trying, whatever nutritional strategy that you're actually trying, that's the kind of the linchpin in everything. If the client or the athlete can demonstrate flexibility once the competition is over, I'm going to change my pattern up.
Yes.
No problem, right? Because they're using it as a tool for a specific end goal. When that flexibility is not there, the rigidity is there, the competition's there, and the behavior continues, those are when the kind of the alarm bells start to sound.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah. And I'm not surprised. I think a lot of us come from that same perspective of, okay, is there flexibility? Is there room for movement? And trying to identify the problematic behaviors.
Because there's a lot of, here's also where I come at it. There's a lot of peanut gallery stuff going on too, which I personally detest, because you never really know what's going on with the individual. But I do think that people are genuinely trying to be helpful. Like just people out in the community that are concerned with people's, health and welfare, that are not on the clinical side, such as, yourself and some of my other colleagues. They're just genuinely trying to be helpful, but a lot of times they don't have on almost all cases, they don't have the toolkit, right, to actually provide like advice and counsel, and to have the right, filter put on things so that they can actually do the right thing. So a lot of the, the peanut gallery, it's not due to them, it's just due to them being kind of like unequipped, I guess is what I'm saying. They want to help, and I want to try to bring tools for people to where they actually can help.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of people might think, hey, this really was effective for me. This could be effective for someone else. And, I'm a big proponent of everybody needs different fueling and nutrition. And although that's not what I'm an expert in, I still think it's really important that everyone looks genetically different. And, you might need something that someone else might not.
So what would you say to a runner that is kind of like coming into the sport, that has just a really high identification with their particular type of exercise, right? They really crave it. They want to do it all the time. And they they start to display behaviors that are that are just not conducive to them kind of like living a full life. And think of they don't see their friends and family as much because they're training. They kind of like forego their responsibilities at home because they are, too like engaged in their training. Like, how do you start to counsel that? How do you start to counsel those athletes initially?
Yeah, I think initially we talk about what it would look like to take a rest day, or a lot of individuals with these sort of behaviors are exercising 2-3 times a day even, and it's like, what would it look like to skip one of those? How would that feel?
So just a little bit, like not
a little
lot,
bit,
a little
right?
bit.
You know, and I think that is so important, is you don't just want to rip it away, because that is, you know, an athlete is who they are. Running or whatever sport you're engaging in, that's an important part of your life. And so ripping all of it away at once can be very distressing. And I don't want to have you never run again. That's not something that would be joyful for anyone. It's more of a, how can we build this relationship with running or whatever the sport may be that is allowing you to live this life. So instead of taking 3 daily runs, could you take 2 on a Wednesday? How would that look for you? And then slowly try to get it back to a more manageable space. And I think that looks different for everyone, because I know I ran a marathon several years ago now, and I know that I was running a lot to be successful. So, you know, backing it off to being like, hey, don't do your long run, that might not be effective in that moment. It's all about trying to rebalance and restructure around it.
It's almost like a progressive overload approach, just like we would use with an athlete. You know, if you're lifting 20 pounds today, you know, tomorrow let's try 22 pounds, right?
Exactly.
If you're running 30 miles a week, let's try 35 miles a week, right? I mean, you're kind of taking that same approach. It's more of a deloading approach, but it's not taking everything away at once, which I'm calling overload. It's just taking the manageable pieces away at once.
Yeah. And I think too, a lot of people listening might think, oh yeah, I could skip my, you know, whatever, my Saturday run to go to a birthday party, no problem. And there's other people that might be listening and thinking, I could not do that. So I think it's easier said than done for many individuals who struggle with this.
Yeah, I often, so when I'm working with athletes that have a hard time like letting go of something very specific, I have them put that in context of the big picture to see if it will make sense to them. Okay, this one workout or this one thing is 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers is probably 1/10 of the entirety of training that you're doing. Yeah. If that is still a big deal to you, we need to work on other things, because it's not, right? Let's just hashtag math the situation out, right? Like from a training perspective, if your goal is to, you know, get better in your sport and all that other thing, that is not a material aspect of it, yet you are blowing you're blowing out of proportion the meaning of this very small fraction of the entirety of training.
And what is the meaning behind that? Is it that because I didn't do this one training component, I can't eat lunch? Is it because I didn't do this one training component that I won't be good at my sport? Like what is it behind it? Because missing things occasionally or skipping should be okay, you know?
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so I mentioned earlier kind of the peanut gallery, and I want to give the opportunity for like you, because you are in the field, right? You know where all the tools are. And there are people in the ultramarathon world that absolutely need to see somebody like yourself or my colleague Kate or, you know, whoever. How do you get people into those resources? Like, what can you tell a friend who their training partner, somebody on their team, somebody in their running club or whatever, they want to like get them some counsel in that area? How would you counsel those people to approach that with their friends and training partners?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really in a public mental health crisis to a certain extent. It is very hard to find a therapist right now in a general sense. I think if you want someone who is going to feel like they can understand what you're going through, a lot of the times there's the Academy for Eating Disorders, and we have eating disorder clinicians, like a director of eating disorder clinicians, and some of those individuals will say, I work with athletes. There's also nutritionists through that you can find sort of more tailored individuals to your needs. I think in general, when you're searching for a therapist, if you're someone who exercise is really important to, you'll want to suss that out in your therapist. Can they understand this? If someone's like, okay, you run ultramarathons, cool, but right now we really need you to not do that. That might not be something that really is like the most effective therapeutic relationship. And I don't know if that would make you feel understood. So I think going in with a perspective of, reading bios, looking if you are searching for someone with an eating disorder background, the Academy for Eating Disorders is a great place to start. There's also the Female Athlete Conference it's every other year, and they present on some amazing research, and there's really great clinicians linked up with that as well. And I know that's right now it's female athlete only, but hopefully that'll still resonate with enough people in the listener base.
Yeah, because the resources are out there, but it's not as common as like a physical therapist, right? I think that's a more common thing where people know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody that had their IT band fixed by so and so
person. Yeah, exactly.
And they struggle a lot with trying to find kind of the right resources. So I'm going to link those up in the show notes, and obviously after the recording, if you want me to put anything else in there, I'll link them up as well.
Definitely.
So before we let you go, Maddie, what's next for you? I mean, you mentioned that you're going to move out to the West Coast. It's big, it's the longest journey across the US that you can probably imagine.
Yeah.
What are you looking to do next in your academic and your clinical career?
So after clinical internship year, I'm really hoping to have like sort of a research and clinical career. My hope is to develop identity related treatment and modules. So right now in eating disorder treatment, we don't really talk about identity. We don't talk about exercise identity or athletic identity. Some treatments really don't address exercise behaviors at all. So I'm really hoping to get into that space and work towards creating identity-focused treatment and working with individuals with exercise, problematic exercise.
I have a feeling that there's going to be I hate to say this because I'm like predicting a doomsday event or something like that, but there are people out there just because of how society is becoming like more and more attached to the sport groups that they're doing as more of a research to cling on to something,
Yeah.
So I think that that's something like that is going to end up being, an incredibly valuable resource, and practitioners in the space are going to be needed.
Yes, I would hope so. And I think too, right now we're in this weird space with like all these different online platforms of telling people what we should or shouldn't be doing for exercise. And so much of that can get internalized when it's maybe that's not safe for you or something. So, I think the exercise space in these next couple of years will be really interesting.
Well, there's a lot of like practitioners in the space, like myself, that are starting to realize that we're kind of like woefully adequate in this area. And I would broaden it out to psychology in general, because we have an incredible sports science history and background within training coaches and people that kind of interact with athletes coming from that sports science side of things. And because of that kind of like dominance, we lack a lot in these other sides. And that's why I have to bring people like you onto the podcast to like help me figure out and help me at least get to like a kindergarten or a fourth grade level, with a lot of this stuff, because the fact of the matter is it is, like you said, we're in a mental health crisis. Mm-hmm. It's becoming more and more important for not only the athletes out there to become educated on it, but the coaches out there that have to be interdisciplinary to become educated on it as well.
Absolutely. And I think especially with disordered eating, and these things are scary for people to want to touch, and so I think the more that we can kind of educate and understand what this might look like and help people question their own relationship with these things, the better off we will all be.
I 100% agree with you. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's always enlightening for me, because like I said, it's an area where I'm trying to get to an elementary school level of proficiency, and it's a constant learning exercise. So I've always been appreciative of people like you in the space. Where can people get to know more about you or the Depth Lab or any of the work that you're doing?
Yes. So the Depth Lab has a website. Let me see if I can remember
I'll link it up in the show notes.
Yeah, you can link it up. Yeah, I'm like, it's USF Depth Lab. And then I'm on Twitter as Maddie A. Palermo. And I tweet about a lot of my research that I do. That's actually a big space where I interface with a lot of different clinicians, people I've never met, different researchers. It's a really great resource just for sharing articles and things of that nature. So feel free to check me out there as well.
Twitter's getting a lot of hate in the mental health space right now, but there are some shining lights in it. If you can kind of like stay in your circle.
My feed is so curated, like I've got my people and that's what I need. And yeah, it's a very safe space for me.
Keep it on the following tab and don't switch over to the for you.
No, never switch over.
There you go. Advice from a professional right there on how to navigate Twitter these days. I've always said that my mute list and my follow list, if I can like curate those really tightly, I've got a good effective Twitter feed at what I want it to do, which is to serve me the best information possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. Got to be careful.
Maybe we'll have a whole episode on how to curate Twitter and we can bring in people from all sides of the space. We'll leave that for the future. Anyway, I appreciate it. Links in the show notes will be to everything that we talked about. But once again, thank you for what you do and coming on the podcast today.
Of course. Great to speak with you.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Maddie for coming on the podcast today and helping me understand a lot more about a topic that I am continually trying to learn about as a coach. As I mentioned from the onset of this podcast, whenever I discuss eating disorders or disordered eating, I always want to make sure that I'm really bringing in the true experts in the room, people that are at the coalface of working with athletes and working with people in order to help them overcome this type of disease or these types of behaviors. Maddie is an excellent example of that. And I encourage everybody out there, if you think you are suffering from disordered eating or an eating disorder, or you have a friend, a training partner, or one of your loved ones that you feel needs help, go to one of the links that I'm leaving in the show notes for the Academy for Eating Disorders. There are a number of resources there, as well as an area where you can find a practitioner or clinician in your area if you choose to reach out to them. Appreciate the heck out of all the listeners out there. If you find this podcast valuable, please share it with your friends, your colleagues, and your training partners. That is the way that we get the word about this podcast out, and I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you. That is it for today, folks, and as always, we will see you out on the trails.